Do you know the idioms that Americans use frequently to discuss problems and challenges in life? Today, I will go over 5 of these idioms with you. Let's see which ones you know. Have you ever had something bad happen only to discover later that it was actually good? Maybe you didn't get the job you wanted. You missed a flight. Your plans got canceled. You failed at something important. At first, it felt terrible, but later, something even better happened. In American English, we often say, a blessing in disguise. But what does that really mean? Today, I'll teach you the exact meaning, how Americans use this idiom, common real life situations, and we will finish with some pronunciation practice. Let's get started. So what does a blessing in disguise mean? Let's break it down. A blessing is something positive. A disguise is something that hides the truth. So a blessing in disguise is a good thing that is hidden inside what looks like a bad situation, a problem that secretly becomes an opportunity. At first, you only see the bad part. Later, you discover the hidden benefit. And Americans use this all the time when talking about jobs, school, relationships, business, travel, life changes, and unexpected problems. Let's look at some real-life situations of how Americans actually use this idiom. I want you to imagine for a moment that you apply for your dream job. You prepare for weeks, you study, you practice interviews, you feel confident. Then you get the dreaded email. You didn't get the job. You're devastated. For weeks you think, why did this happen? A month later, something unexpected happens. Another company contacts you. The salary is higher, the hours are better, the office is closer to home. The manager is supportive. You accept the new position. A year later, you say, not getting that first job was really a blessing in disguise. At the time, it felt like a failure, but it actually led to something much better. And that's exactly what Americans mean when they use this idiom. Let's look at another situation where we would use this idiom. I want you to imagine that you're flying to another city for a business meeting. You get stuck in traffic on the way to the airport. By the time you arrive, the plane has already left. You're furious. You spent money on the ticket. You planned the entire trip. Now everything is ruined. The next available flight isn't until the next morning. Since you have some unexpected free time, you decide to stop by the office before heading home. While there, you run into a client that you haven't seen in years. You start talking. The client mentions a major project his company is planning. A few weeks later, you win the contract. The project becomes one of the biggest deals of your career. Looking back, you could say, missing that flight was a blessing in disguise. Let's look at another example. I want you to imagine a small business owner. One day, his biggest client leaves. That client represented nearly 40% of his income. He can't sleep. He panics. He's worried his business might fail. Since he can no longer rely on one customer, he starts marketing aggressively. Over the next year, he gains 10 new clients. His business becomes larger than ever. And now he's no longer dependent on a single customer. Years later, he says, losing that client was really a blessing in disguise. As you can see in this example, if the business owner hadn't lost that large client, he wouldn't have taken the initiative to market aggressively and really try to acquire the new customers. I want you to imagine now a woman who has worked for a company for 8 years. One morning, she gets called into a meeting. The company is downsizing. Her position is being eliminated. She feels shocked. She worries about paying bills. She worries about her future. But while searching for new opportunities, she realizes something. She never actually enjoyed her old job. She had just become comfortable. A few months later, she starts her own consulting business. She earns more money, she has more freedom, and she controls her own schedule. Years later, she tells people, getting laid off was a blessing in disguise. Let's look at one more example. I want you to picture a teenager who tries out for the best soccer team in his city. He's convinced he'll make it. When the results are posted, his name isn't there. He's heartbroken. For weeks, he feels discouraged. Then he joins a smaller team. The coach notices his dedication and spends extra time training him. His skills improve dramatically. A year later, he earns a spot on an even better team than the one he originally wanted. Later, he looks back and says, not making the first team was a blessing in disguise. So remember, a blessing in disguise starts with something negative that later becomes something positive. And that's the key idea. Now, let's work on your pronunciation. Repeat after me. It was a blessing in disguise. It was a blessing in disguise. It was a blessing in disguise. Have you ever had something bad happen? Then suddenly, 3 more problems appear? Maybe your car breaks down. Your phone stops working. Then you get an unexpected bill. Or maybe you get sick, miss an important meeting, and your internet stops working at home. You start thinking, seriously, why is everything happening at once? Americans have a very common expression for situations like this. We say, when it rains, it pours. And today, I'll teach you what this idiom means, how Americans use it, common situations where you'll hear it, how to use it naturally in conversation, and finally, we will end with some pronunciation practice. Let's get started. So what does it mean when it rains, it pours? Let's break this idiom down. Think about real rain for a moment. Sometimes it rains lightly. You only get a few drops. But other times the rain comes down very hard and fast. That's called a pour or a downpour. Now let's look at this idiom. In this expression, the rain represents problems, difficulties, or bad events. And the pouring represents those problems coming all at once. So when Americans say, when it rains, it pours, they mean when problems start happening, they often seem to arrive one after another or all at the same time. And it's as if life doesn't just send you one problem, instead it sends several. I want you to notice one thing. It doesn't mean actual rain. It's about difficult situations in life. For example, I lost my wallet, then my car wouldn't start, and then I got a parking ticket. When it rains, it pours. In other words, everything went wrong at once. Now, let's look at some real-life examples of how we would actually use this idiom. Imagine this. You wake up late for work. Your alarm never goes off. You jump out of bed and rush to get dressed. Then you spill coffee all over your shirt. Now you have to change clothes. When you finally leave the house, your car won't start. You call a tow truck. Because of all the delays, you're already late. Then your boss calls and says, don't forget your presentation starts in 10 minutes. You sigh and say, of course, when it rains, it pours. Why? Because one problem was followed by another, and another, and another. And that's exactly how Americans use this expression. Let's look at another example. Let's imagine this woman who owns a house. One day, she notices water leaking from her roof. That's already expensive. A few days later, her air conditioner stops working. Then, her washing machine breaks. Then, she gets a surprise repair bill. She tells her friend, I've spent thousands of dollars this month. Her friend asks, what happened? She laughs and says, honestly, when it rains, it pours. Again, multiple problems happened close together. This is the perfect use of this idiom. Let's look at another example. Mark had been unemployed for several months. Finally, he got invited to an important job interview. He was excited because this could be the opportunity that he had been waiting for. The morning of the interview, everything seemed fine. But when he left his house, he got stuck in heavy traffic. While sitting in traffic, he realized he had forgotten copies of his resume at home. Then, just before arriving, his car got a flat tire. At that point, Mark couldn't help but laugh. He called the interviewer to explain the situation and said, "Wow, when it rains, it pours." Why did he use this expression? Because it wasn't just one problem. First, he got stuck in traffic. Then, he forgot his resume. Then, he got a flat tire. The problems kept coming, one after another. That's exactly what Americans mean when they say, "When it rains, it pours." Sometimes, life feels like a light rain of problems. And at other times, it feels like a downpour, like everything seems to go wrong at once. How else do Americans use this idiom? You might hear someone say, "I lost my job and my car broke down the same week. When it rains, it pours." Or, "My dog got sick, my refrigerator stopped working, and I had to pay unexpected taxes. When it rains, it pours." Or, "We had one problem after another. When it rains, it pours." I want you to notice something. Americans usually say this idiom after describing several problems. It's a way of saying everything seemed to go wrong at once. Now, let's work on your pronunciation. Repeat after me. When it rains, it pours. When it rains, it pours. When it rains, it pours. Have you ever said yes to something and later thought, "Why did I agree to this?" Maybe you accepted too much work. You tried to study for 5 exams in 1 week. You started 3 different projects at the same time. Or you promised to help everyone and now you're completely overwhelmed. In American English, we often say, "I bit off more than I could chew." But what does that really mean? Today, I'll teach you the exact meaning, how Americans use this idiom in daily life, common situations where you'll hear it, and how you can use it to sound more natural speaking English. Let's get started. So what does bite off more than you can chew mean? Bite off more than you can chew means to take on more responsibilities, work, or challenges than you can actually handle. In simple English, you try to do too much. Think about food for a second. If you literally bit off a giant piece of food that is too big, you can't chew it properly. And that's exactly the idea behind this idiom. You accepted more than you were ready for. Americans use this expression all the time when talking about work, school, business, relationships, money, personal goals, and stressful situations. You could say, "I agreed to work 2 jobs while taking classes full-time. I definitely bit off more than I could chew." That means the person tried to do too many things at once. Now let's look at how Americans actually use this idiom in real life. This is very common in professional and business English. For example, I could say, "I took on 3 major clients this month and now I'm completely exhausted. I bit off more than I could chew." This means the workload became too much. Another example, "My manager warned me not to bite off more than I could chew." That means my manager said, "Don't accept more work than you can actually handle." Or, "The company expanded too quickly and bit off more than it could chew." This means the business grew too fast and couldn't manage everything. Now, in a school setting, students use this expression a lot. For example, I could say, "I signed up for 6 difficult classes this semester. I think I bit off more than I can chew." This means the student may have taken too many difficult courses. Americans also use this idiom for personal situations in everyday life. For example, I could say, "I tried to renovate my entire house by myself. I definitely bit off more than I could chew." This means the project was bigger or harder than expected. Imagine this. A man starts a small online business. At first, things are going great. He has a few customers. Everything feels easy. But then he gets excited and suddenly launches 5 new products, starts posting on every social media platform, tries to answer every customer himself, begins working 16 hours a day. At first he thinks, I can handle this. But after a few weeks, he's stressed, he's sleeping very little, customers are angry because responses are slow, orders are getting delayed. Finally, he says, I think I bit off more than I could chew. This means he accepted more responsibility than he could actually manage, and this is exactly how Americans use this idiom. Now, there are a few common mistakes that English learners make with this expression. First, you don't want to say, I chewed more than I can bite. That sounds unnatural in English. The correct way would be to say, I bit off more than I could chew. That is the full natural expression. Another mistake, some learners forget the off by saying, I bit more than I could chew. Remember, you have to include off. Bit off more than I could chew. The off is very important. Now, let's work on your pronunciation. Repeat after me. Bite off more than you can chew. Bite off more than you can chew. Bite off more than you can chew. Have you ever been in a situation where a problem was already bad and then someone did or said something that made it even worse? Maybe 2 coworkers are arguing and another employee starts taking sides. Your friend is already upset and someone makes a rude joke. Your spouse is angry and you bring up another complaint from last month. Instead of helping the situation, they make it worse. Americans have a very common expression for this. We say, add fuel to the fire. Today, I'll teach you what this idiom means, how Americans really use it, as well as go over some common mistakes English learners make, and we will end with some pronunciation practice. Let's get started. So what does add fuel to the fire mean? Imagine a real fire. If a fire is burning and someone pours more gasoline or adds wood to it, what happens? Well, the fire gets bigger. It becomes more intense. And that's exactly what this idiom means. To add fuel to the fire means to make an already bad situation worse. And usually this happens because of something someone says, something someone does, or an action that increases anger, stress, conflict, or problems. Some examples are, the argument was already heated and his comment added fuel to the fire. Or the company was facing criticism and the CEO's statement added fuel to the fire. Don't bring up politics at dinner. You'll just add fuel to the fire. Now, to make sure that this idiom makes sense, we're going to look at some real life examples of how Americans actually use this idiom. I want you to picture Sarah. Sarah was already frustrated with her husband, Mike. For weeks, Mike had been coming home late from work. He wasn't helping with the dishes. He wasn't helping with the kids. He kept leaving his clothes on the floor. Sarah had been trying to stay calm, but she was reaching her limit. One evening, Mike came home almost an hour late. Sarah was clearly upset. Instead of apologizing, Mike walked into the kitchen and said, "What's for dinner?" Sarah just stared at him. Then Mike looked around and said, "Wow, the house is kind of messy today." That was a terrible thing to say. Sarah was already angry, and his comments made her even angrier. Mike didn't calm the situation. He added fuel to the fire. Now, I want you to imagine an employee who was always late. Kevin had a reputation at work. He was late almost every day. 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late, sometimes 20 minutes late. His manager had already spoken to him several times. His coworkers were frustrated because they often had to cover his responsibilities. One Monday morning, Kevin arrived 30 minutes late. Everyone in the office noticed. His manager called him into her office. She was already upset, but instead of apologizing, Kevin laughed and said, "Relax. It's not like anything important happens in the first half hour anyway." The manager couldn't believe what she heard. Now, she was even more annoyed. Kevin's joke didn't help. It added fuel to the fire. A few days later, he received a formal warning. Now, I want you to imagine two neighbors, Tom and David, and they were having problems. David's dog kept digging holes near the property line. Tom had complained several times. The situation was already tense. One Saturday morning, Tom discovered another large hole in his yard. He walked over to David's house to discuss it. The conversation started calmly. Then David said, "Maybe if you took better care of your yard, you wouldn't notice a few holes." Now, Tom was furious. The discussion immediately became an argument. The situation had been manageable before, but David's comment added fuel to the fire. And soon, both neighbors were yelling at each other across the street. Now, you'll often hear this expression when people are discussing arguments, family conflicts, workplace problems, political debates, or in social media discussions. Some other examples are, posting that comment only added fuel to the fire. His reaction added fuel to the fire. The reporter's question added fuel to the fire. Don't add fuel to the fire. I want you to notice that Americans often use this idiom when they think someone is making a bad situation worse instead of helping. So there are a couple mistakes that I want you to avoid. First, do not use it for new problems. Now, some learners use this idiom when a problem starts, and that's not correct. The situation must already be bad. We wouldn't say, "My car broke down, so fuel was added to the fire." We would say, "My car had already broken down, and then I got a parking ticket." That added fuel to the fire. The second mistake to avoid is to say, "He put fuel on the fire." This is not correct. Remember, you have to say, "He added fuel to the fire." Now, let's work on your pronunciation. Repeat after me. Add fuel to the fire. Add fuel to the fire. Add fuel to the fire. Have you ever been patient with someone for a long time? Maybe one of your employees keeps arriving late. Your neighbor keeps playing loud music. Your internet keeps getting disconnected during important meetings. You stay calm, you forgive them, you give them another chance, and another chance, and another chance, but one day something happens that finally makes you lose your patience. Americans have a very common expression for this situation. We say, "That's the last straw." Today, I'll teach you what the last straw means, where this idiom comes from, how Americans really use it with real-life examples, and we'll finish with pronunciation practice. Let's get started. So what does the last straw mean? When Americans say, "That's the last straw," we mean that's the final small problem that causes someone to become upset after many previous problems. Usually, the last event isn't the biggest problem. It's simply the final problem that pushes someone over their limit. Think of it like carrying a heavy backpack. You keep adding books. One more book, another book, another book. Finally, you add one tiny pencil and the backpack breaks. The pencil wasn't the biggest problem. It was simply the final thing that caused the break. And that's exactly how the last straw works. The full expression is actually the straw that broke the camel's back. Imagine a camel carrying bundles of straw. You keep adding more straw, the camel keeps carrying it. Then one final piece of straw is added. That tiny piece causes the camel's back to break. Again, it wasn't the biggest piece. It was simply the final one. Over time, Americans shortened the expression to the last straw. Let's look at some real-life situations of how Americans use this idiom. Imagine Lisa. For years, Lisa felt like she was carrying the entire family on her shoulders. She got the kids ready for school every morning. She packed lunches. She helped with homework. She scheduled doctor's appointments. She did the grocery shopping. She cooked dinner. She cleaned the house. Meanwhile, her husband rarely helped. When she asked him to pick up the kids, he often forgot. When she asked him to help with homework, he said he was too tired. When she asked him to help around the house, he promised, but he rarely followed through. Lisa tried to be patient. They talked about it many times. She gave him chance after chance. Then their 15th wedding anniversary arrived. Lisa had planned a special dinner and even arranged for a babysitter. That evening, her husband stayed late with friends and completely forgot about their anniversary. When he finally came home, he didn't even realize what day it was. Lisa looked at him and thought, this is the last straw. Forgetting their anniversary wasn't the biggest problem in their marriage. It was simply the final event after years of feeling unsupported, unappreciated, and alone. A few months later, they filed for divorce. This example perfectly illustrates the idiom because forgetting the anniversary wasn't what caused the divorce itself. It was the last straw after years of many other problems. Now I want you to imagine Tom. For months, Tom was the employee who could never arrive on time. On Monday, he showed up 10 minutes late. On Tuesday, 15 minutes late. On Wednesday, 20 minutes late with a coffee in his hand. Every time he had an excuse. Sorry, traffic was terrible. My alarm didn't go off. There was a long line at the coffee shop. His manager tried to be understanding. She gave him warnings. She had private conversations with him. She even adjusted his schedule to help him succeed. But nothing changed. Then, one Friday, the entire team arrived early for an important meeting with a major client. Everyone was there except Tom. The client was waiting. The presentation couldn't start without him because he was responsible for a key section. 10 minutes passed, then 20, still no Tom. Finally, he rushed through the door, 30 minutes late, holding a breakfast sandwich and saying, "Sorry, I overslept." The manager looked at him and thought, that was the last straw. Oversleeping that morning wasn't the biggest problem. It was simply the final incident after months of lateness, excuses, and missed opportunities. The following week, Tom was let go. This is a perfect example of the last straw because the employee wasn't fired for being late one single time. He was fired because the final late arrival came after a long pattern of problems. I want you to imagine now that you have had a roommate for almost a year. At first, everything seems fine. But little by little, your roommate's bad habits start driving you crazy. Maybe your roommate leaves their dirty dishes in the sink for days, leaves half-empty soda cans scattered around the living room. Dirty socks appear everywhere, on the couch, under the coffee table, even in the kitchen. Every morning you walk into the bathroom and find wet towels thrown on the floor. Your roommate never takes out the trash. And in fact, he would keep stuffing things into the overflowing trash can until garbage was literally falling onto the floor. You try to be patient. You politely ask him to clean up after himself. His response is always the same. Yeah, I'll do it later. But later never comes. Then things get worse. He starts eating your food without asking. The milk disappears. The leftovers that you've been saving for lunch mysteriously vanish. Still, you try to keep the peace. One Saturday morning, you wake up excited to make your favorite coffee. You walk into the kitchen, grab the coffee maker, and open the cabinet. The coffee is gone. Your roommate had used the entire bag and left the empty package sitting on the counter. At that moment, you stare at the empty bag and think, this is the last straw. The missing coffee wasn't the biggest problem. It wasn't even close. It was simply the final annoyance after months of messes, broken promises, and disrespect. A few weeks later, you find a new apartment. Now, let's work on your pronunciation. Repeat after me. This is the last straw. This is the last straw. This is the last straw. Idioms are one of the fastest ways to take your English to the next level. If you haven't already seen my playlist on idioms that Americans use every day, make sure to click here.